The most dangerous thing in the world isn't evil. It's stupidity. Not the kind that makes you laugh. Not the harmless mistakes of someone who simply doesn't know. But the deep, systemic, contagious kind of stupidity that moves through crowds like wildfire. The kind that obeys orders without question, follows rules without understanding, and enforces cruelty without thought. It's easy to imagine that history's horrors were crafted by monsters. It's more comforting that way. That genocide, war, and totalitarianism were all the product of uniquely wicked minds. But what if they weren't? What if they were built by average people, ordinary men and women who thought they were doing the right thing, or worse, never thought at all? Imagine this: a nation turning on its neighbors, its friends, its own people. Not overnight, not with grand declarations, but slowly, quietly, as one by one, individuals chose silence over courage, obedience over conscience. There's no drama in that. No cinematic villain with a scar, just paperwork, nods, uniforms, stamps. Orders followed, and the world crumbled not with a roar, but with a shrug. In the heart of Nazi Germany, a young theologian named Dietrich Bonhoeffer watched all of this unfold. He was not a soldier, not a politician, he wasn't even loud. But he saw something most didn't. He saw a sickness spreading, not just through laws or guns, but through minds. And what terrified him most wasn't the evil men leading the charge, it was the compliant millions behind them. Bonhoeffer would call it stupidity, but not the way we use the word today. He didn't mean low intelligence. He meant a kind of moral paralysis, a surrendering of thought, a blindness chosen for comfort. In his words, stupidity is a more dangerous enemy of the good than malice. One may protest against evil. It can be exposed. Evil always carries within itself the seeds of its own destruction. But against stupidity, we are defenseless. Defenseless, because you can't argue with it. You can't reach it. Stupidity, as he saw it, had nothing to do with reason, and everything to do with surrender. But this isn't just history. It's happening again. Right now. You've seen it. In online mobs that cancel without context. In citizens who repeat slogans without knowing what they mean. In institutions that reward obedience over wisdom. The same patterns, the same silence, the same shrug. Ask yourself, how many times have you witnessed injustice, misinformation, or cruelty, and seen good people say nothing? How often have you seen truth replaced with convenience? The question is no longer, what is right, but what is safe to say? And in that silence, stupidity grows. It feeds on comfort, on apathy, on the need to belong, because people would rather fit in with a lie than stand alone with the truth. Bonhoeffer's warning wasn't just about Nazis, it was about us, about how quickly our minds become tools when we stop using them, about how evil doesn't need evil people, it just needs passive ones. This isn't a history lesson, it's a mirror, and if you're brave enough to look into it, you might just see the question staring back: what am I obeying, without thinking? Because the world doesn't collapse when bad men rise. It collapses when good people become silent. When thought is replaced with loyalty. When intellect is traded for belonging. And when truth is sacrificed, not to evil, but to stupidity. So before we begin, ask yourself this: when was the last time you stood still, thought deeply, and asked not what do others believe, but what do I believe? Because that may be the most dangerous question of all, and perhaps the most powerful. Now imagine a man sitting in a prison cell, not because he broke the law in some malicious way, but because he refused to surrender his mind. Dietrich Bonhoeffer had choices, many of them. He could have stayed in America when the war began, taught theology, lived safely, written books, but something pulled him back to Germany, to his home, to the heart of the beast. Why? Because he understood something that most people still refuse to grasp. Silence, in times of moral crisis, is not neutral, it is complicit. Bonhoeffer didn't just speak out against the Nazi regime, he acted, secretly aiding Jews, participating in underground resistance, even being involved in a plot to assassinate Hitler. A theologian, a man of faith, a man taught to turn the other cheek, and yet he understood that in times of organized evil, passivity becomes poison, that sometimes preserving your soul means staining your hands, that doing nothing is still doing something. This is where his theory of stupidity deepens. He noticed that when people give up their responsibility to think, they become dangerous, not just to themselves, but to everyone around them. They become vessels for ideology, empty cups filled by whatever authority is loudest. You've seen this, we all have. In offices, in classrooms, on the news, on social media, people who repeat lines they don't understand, defend systems they've never questioned, and attack anyone who deviates from the script. And here's the terrifying part. They don't know they're doing it. That's what makes this version of stupidity so powerful. It wears the mask of morality. It believes it's righteous. It sees disagreement as evil. Bonhoeffer warned us, when people fall under this spell, persuasion fails, logic fails, evidence fails, because they're no longer thinking individuals. They're echoes. You might be wondering, how do people get this way? How does a rational person dissolve into a puppet? Bonhoeffer believed it happened in stages. First fear, then isolation, then the seduction of belonging. It begins when people are told that questioning is dangerous, that disagreement equals disloyalty, that safety lies in unity, even if that unity is built on lies. Once that foundation is laid, stupidity thrives, because stupidity isn't passive, it's viral. It spreads through communities, institutions, entire nations. It becomes culture. Think of every regime that ever ruled through fear, every cult that demanded loyalty, every system that punished thought. What they all shared wasn't just power, it was the manufacturing of stupidity, the rewriting of truth, the rewarding of obedience, the slow erosion of independent thought, until the masses didn't just comply, they believed. And that belief? That's what terrifies thinkers. Because you can debate a liar, you can challenge a tyrant, but you can't wake someone who thinks their obedience is virtue. That's the wall Bonhoeffer ran into. Again and again, he wasn't fighting monsters, he was fighting silence, shrugs, smiles, the calm blind loyalty of everyday people doing what they were told. Now ask yourself, where do you see this today? Who around you has traded thought for tribe? Who repeats without reflecting? And most importantly, where have you done it? Because this isn't just about them, it's about us, about the ways we stay quiet, about the lies we let pass, because we don't want to be difficult, about the truths we soften because they make others uncomfortable. Bonhoeffer didn't die because he was a radical, he died because he refused to be stupid. And in a world addicted to comfort, that is the most radical act of all. Stupidity, as Bonhoeffer defined it, isn't just a lack of intelligence, it's the surrender of one's will to think. And what makes this surrender so chilling is how ordinary it looks. It doesn't come with rage or fire, it walks in quietly, dressed in slogans, it smiles, it obeys, it adapts, and in doing so, it gives power to forces far darker than it understands. That's what Bonhoeffer saw, how good people, decent people could be molded into tools, not through force but through comfort, repetition, and fear of exclusion. He watched as churches bowed to political pressure, as neighbors turned on one another, in the name of national purity, as people stopped asking, "Is this right?" and started asking, "Will this make me safer?" The great tragedy wasn't that evil had a voice, it was that reason went silent. And silence, in Bonhoeffer's view, was more than cowardice, it was complicity. Because in times of injustice, neutrality is a myth. You are either preserving human dignity, or allowing its destruction. That's why his theory still cuts so deeply today, because we still want to believe we can opt out, that we can float above the conflict, that as long as we're not actively hurting anyone, we're doing our part. But that's not what history teaches us. That's not what Bonhoeffer's life teaches us. Think about it. He wasn't executed for committing violence, he was executed for thinking dangerously, for resisting passively, for refusing to salute when the world demanded it. And yet his resistance was louder than any speech. It was the kind of resistance that scares regimes, the kind that refuses to bend even when it's silent, the kind that lives on after the body is gone. So ask yourself, what does resistance look like today? It's not always protests or boycotts. Sometimes it's simply saying no. It's choosing not to echo what you don't believe. It's choosing silence over slogans, reflection over reaction, presence over popularity. It's asking questions that make others uncomfortable, and being okay with the discomfort. Because that's where clarity begins. in the discomfort, in the pause before you speak, in the courage to stand alone. That's what Bonhoeffer modeled, not just defiance, but discipline. He didn't shout, he didn't rage, he thought, he wrote, he stayed still in a world that demanded motion, and in that stillness, he found his power. You see, true resistance isn't always about noise. Sometimes it's about presence, about refusing to be moved by fear, about letting your life say what your words never can. That's what made Bonhoeffer so dangerous to the Nazis. Not his politics, not his plans, his clarity, his refusal to be absorbed into the machinery of stupidity. And that's why his message matters now, maybe more than ever, because stupidity is still viral, still seductive, still cloaked in culture, tradition, patriotism, even the greater good. But clarity, that's rare, that's costly, that demands attention. So the question isn't whether you agree with Bonhoeffer. The question is, do you recognize his warning in the world around you? And more importantly, do you recognize it in yourself? Because that's where the battle begins. Not in the streets, not in parliament, but in the mirror, where you decide, will I think, or will I follow? Will I question, or will I nod? Will I live clearly, or comfortably? These aren't just intellectual questions, they're spiritual ones, moral ones, the kind that don't ask you to be perfect, only awake, only honest, only brave enough to say, I will not be stupid, not like this, not now, not again. And that refusal, I will not be stupid, is not a declaration of superiority, it's a commitment to vigilance. Because the seduction of stupidity is constant. It doesn't announce itself with red flags. It whispers, it flatters, it rewards you for agreeing with the crowd. It makes ignorance feel like belonging. And that's the real danger Bonhoeffer saw, not just in others, but in himself, in all of us. You see, stupidity isn't reserved for the uneducated, or the unthinking. It can infect the intellectual, the devout, the well-meaning, because it's not about knowledge. It's about surrender. The moment you stop thinking critically, the moment you replace conscience with consensus, the moment you outsource your beliefs to the nearest group, party, platform, or ideology, that's when stupidity takes root, quietly, deeply. Bonhoeffer believed this process was spiritual, that evil didn't need to shout if stupidity would obey, that tyranny didn't need to be imposed, it could be invited, through silence, through inaction, through the warm comfort of agreeing with everyone around you. And that's what makes his warning so timeless. The enemy of reason is not rage, it's routine, normalcy, the gradual fading of moral questions into social habits. Ask yourself, when was the last time you changed your mind, not because of pressure, but because of thought? When was the last time you let silence speak before a decision, or stepped outside the group just to make sure your values still had their own shape? That's what Bonhoeffer asked of himself, not to be right, but to be real, to stay human in an age that made humanity feel optional. And make no mistake, that's still the challenge. Today's world doesn't always look like the Germany of 1943, but the architecture of stupidity remains. It's in the headlines that tell you what to think before you've read them, in the feeds that echo your opinions back to you like gospel, in the pressure to speak without listening, to perform without pausing, to agree without understanding. Stupidity in this sense is not just ignorance. It's the abandonment of self-governance. It's the ease of becoming a product of your surroundings, instead of a participant in your own becoming. And Bonhoeffer saw that ease for what it was: deadly, not just to the thinker, but to democracy, to justice, to the soul itself. And yet his theory isn't one of despair, it's a call to arms, not with weapons, but with awareness, not with blame, but with personal responsibility. Bonhoeffer wasn't trying to shame the world into awakening, he was trying to stir it, gently, fiercely, through example, through questions, through the quiet power of a life lived with clarity. That's what makes his insight revolutionary, not that it exposed others, but that it demanded more of himself. He didn't just ask why others were so blind, he asked, where am I blind? Where have I fallen asleep in comfort? Where have I mistaken conformity for conscience? These are questions that don't age, they grow louder with time, and they're not meant to guilt you, they're meant to guard you, because the world doesn't need more outrage, it needs more discernment, and that begins with recognizing that stupidity is not out there somewhere, It's here, at our doorstep, in our habits, in our need to belong, and resisting it isn't a performance. It's a practice, one that starts every day, with a single powerful decision. I will think, I will pause, I will not surrender my mind, not to fear, not to noise, not to the comfort of the unexamined crowd. Bonhoeffer understood something most people still resist, that silence in the face of moral decay is not neutral, it is complicity, and that's what scared him most, not the presence of evil men, but the absence of thoughtful resistance, not the guns, not the uniforms, not even the swastikas, but the quiet apathy of decent people who looked away, who shrugged, who called it just politics, who told themselves it was easier to keep going than to speak up. He saw how entire societies sleepwalked into darkness, not because they were inherently cruel, but because they were comfortably stupid, and that comfort made them controllable. You see, Bonhoeffer's warning wasn't about fascism alone, it was about something older, something primal, the human tendency to trade conscience for convenience. He watched friends and neighbors, good people, fall under the spell of slogans, routines and national pride, and he asked, how does a man, a woman, a society reach a point where evil feels reasonable? His answer was devastating. It starts with the death of independent thought, with the moment you no longer ask, is this right, but instead ask, is this normal? Because once the question shifts from morality to normality, anything can be justified, anything. That's what allowed injustice to pass through the gates of Germany, not in a flood, but in a slow drip, a law here, a silence there, a compromise made, not with malice, but with fatigue, and fatigue, Bonhoeffer believed, was the perfect soil for stupidity, because when the mind is tired, it seeks safety, not truth, it clings to authority, not responsibility, it bows, just to stop thinking, just to stop feeling. He wasn't angry at the stupid, he pitied them, because he knew stupidity made people prisoners of their own minds, and once you're inside that prison, truth becomes a threat, logic becomes noise, and any voice that disrupts the comfort of obedience becomes an enemy. That's why stupidity, to Bonhoeffer, was more dangerous than evil, because it couldn't be argued with, it couldn't be educated, it couldn't be persuaded, only uprooted, by first recognizing it in yourself. And here's the part that still stings. Bonhoeffer wasn't writing to strangers, he was writing to his own people, his own country, his own church, the same church that bowed to Hitler, that quoted scripture while turning a blind eye to genocide, that chose sermons over resistance. He didn't call them monsters, he called them stupid, because that was more accurate, and more damning. So what do we do with that today? We examine our own habits. Where do we follow the crowd without question? Where do we stay silent out of convenience? Where do we scroll, consume, obey, without ever checking our pulse of conscience? These aren't rhetorical questions, they're spiritual exercises, because as Bonhoeffer taught, stupidity isn't just a failure of the mind, it's a surrender of the soul, and reclaiming that soul, it begins with discomfort, with asking the question no one wants to hear, what if I'm wrong? What if I've been asleep? What if the crowd I'm following is heading toward a cliff, and I'm just another footstep in the parade? That's the real courage Bonhoeffer lived and died with, not the courage to fight others, but the courage to interrogate himself, and in doing so, he gave us all permission to ask the harder questions, the ones that free us, the ones that cost us, the ones that could, if we let them, save us.
And this is where Bonhoeffer's legacy stops being a history lesson and becomes a mirror. Because what he saw wasn't some unique anomaly of 1940s Germany, it was a human pattern, one that repeats across generations, continents, and ideologies. It's not always wrapped in flags or fueled by dictators. Sometimes, it's subtle, hidden in the comfort of conformity, buried in the algorithms of distraction, echoed in the passive phrase, "That's just the way things are." Bonhoeffer was haunted by how easily intelligent people surrendered their minds when threatened with discomfort, how quickly professors, theologians, artists, neighbors, all once independent and critical thinkers became mouthpieces for power when that power promised them safety, status, or simplicity. He saw that intelligence, without moral backbone, meant nothing.
That brilliance could be used to justify atrocity just as easily as it could be used to resist it. Because at the core of Bonhoeffer's critique wasn't just a warning about government, it was a challenge to the soul. A challenge to every person who tells themselves, "I'm not political," or "that doesn't affect me," or "it's not my place." He knew that evil doesn't need your hatred. It only needs your indifference. It doesn't need you to march with it. It only needs you to stay home, stay quiet, stay comfortable. That's the kind of stupidity that worried him most. The kind that dresses itself in politeness, in civility, in neutral observation while the world burns. And if you think this doesn't apply to you, ask yourself, when was the last time you questioned the systems around you? Not just complained about them, but really questioned them, their purpose, their cost, their victims. Ask yourself who benefits from your silence, who gains when you choose convenience over confrontation, who gets stronger every time you scroll past injustice because it's just too exhausting to care. Bonhoeffer wasn't just writing about others, he was writing to each of us. Because the battle between clarity and stupidity doesn't happen on grand stages. It happens in your daily choices, in whether you speak when it's easier to stay silent, in whether you think when it's easier to repeat, in whether you walk away from the crowd when it's easier to blend in. That's where the war is fought, not in history books, but in your own conscience. And here's the brutal truth. Courage is lonely, resistance is quiet, and clarity, it often costs more than confusion. But Bonhoeffer believed that clarity, once found, was worth any price. Because to see clearly is to live freely, even if that freedom isolates you, even if it costs you friends, comfort, even your place in polite society. He understood that truth isn't always popular, but it is always powerful. So if you feel like the world is asking you to pick a side, to close your eyes, to play dumb in the name of peace, remember Bonhoeffer. Remember that silence isn't neutral. That obedience isn't innocence. That stupidity is not just ignorance. It is the active rejection of responsibility. And in a world so desperate to keep you compliant, the most radical thing you can do is think fully, fearlessly, and above all, faithfully. And this brings us to the most uncomfortable realization of all, the part that no one wants to admit but Bonhoeffer stared straight in the face, that stupidity, when it becomes widespread, is not simply a failure of education. It is a failure of courage. And that's a harder problem to fix. Because you can teach facts, you can offer knowledge, you can even provide moral guidance, but you cannot make someone brave. Bonhoeffer saw this in the Germany he loved, the people he trusted, the institutions he respected. He saw them all buckle, not under bombs or threats, but under the quiet pressure of collective cowardice, a kind of national breath-holding, where everyone waits for someone else to speak, someone else to act, someone else to say what they already know is wrong. And in that pause, evil gains ground. In that silence, cruelty finds its voice. In that delay, history is written by the loudest, not the wisest. He didn't blame them all individually. That's what makes his theory so chilling. He knew many of them weren't cruel people. They weren't even particularly ideological. They were just tired, afraid, desperate for normalcy. And in that desperation, they made one deadly mistake. They traded their clarity for comfort. They turned off their minds, believing it would buy them peace. But what it bought them was a regime that fed on that passivity. And it never stopped feeding. What Bonhoeffer tried to tell the world, what he paid for with his life, is that stupidity isn't just a weakness, it's a weapon, one of the most effective ever invented. Because it doesn't feel like a weapon. It doesn't burn or cut, it just delays, it deflects, it confuses. And while we argue semantics and defend the status quo, the machinery of oppression hums quietly in the background, unchecked, uninterrupted. And here's the part that hits the hardest. The people who become stupid in this way, they don't even realize it. That's what makes it so dangerous. You can't reason someone out of a place they didn't reason themselves into. Logic doesn't work on them. Because they're not operating from logic. They're operating from fear, from repetition, from a desire to not stand out. They wear stupidity like armor, because thinking feels too risky, too isolating, too heavy. Bonhoeffer wasn't cynical,
He didn't believe people were hopeless, but he did believe that hope was useless without clarity. And clarity requires pain. The pain of admitting you've been wrong. The pain of seeing your friends differently. The pain of realizing that safety might not be moral, and that morality might not be safe. He chose that pain, and he paid for it. So now the question turns to us. In our world, in our time, when we see stupidity, not just ignorance, but willful detachment from consequence, how do we respond? Do we shake our heads and scroll past? Do we mock it with sarcasm? Or do we do what Bonhoeffer did? Do we confront it, not with anger, but with unshakable clarity? Because the longer we allow stupidity to masquerade as neutrality, the more power it gathers, and the more power it gathers, the fewer voices remain. Until, one day, all that's left is silence, and the ones who should have spoken long ago finally realize they can't. And perhaps the most haunting part of Bonhoeffer's warning is that stupidity doesn't need a grand stage to do damage. It doesn't need mass rallies, or propaganda machines, or even authoritarian regimes. Sometimes, all it needs is a room full of people who would rather be comfortable than honest. A dinner table where no one wants to ruin the mood. A boardroom where no one questions the popular opinion. A school where silence is safer than curiosity. That is where it grows, in the spaces where truth becomes impolite, and politeness becomes more important than principle. Bonhoeffer saw that evil doesn't always arrive shouting. Sometimes it comes dressed in smiles, cloaked in tradition, echoing what feels familiar. And stupidity, this particular passive kind, is its perfect accomplice. Because stupidity doesn't demand, it absorbs, it nods, it avoids, it makes space for the unacceptable, by simply not rejecting it. And when that becomes normal, everything else, empathy, reason, resistance, starts to feel extreme. We live in a time of overwhelming information. Never before has so much knowledge been so easily available to so many people. And yet, Bonhoeffer's words echo louder than ever, because access to information does not automatically create wisdom. In fact, when comfort becomes the priority, too much information can lead to more noise, more confusion, more opportunity to retreat into the easy answer instead of the right one. That's when stupidity becomes not just a hazard, but a system. One that rewards the passive and punishes the clear. And we've all seen it, haven't we? In our timelines, in our workplaces, even in ourselves. That impulse to look away, to scroll past, to say not my business, to retreat into convenience rather than confront what's uncomfortable. That's where Bonhoeffer's challenge pierces the modern soul, because he doesn't give us the luxury of neutrality. He forces us to ask, if we are not pushing against stupidity, are we in some small way becoming part of it? It's a terrifying question, because it means that resisting evil isn't always about dramatic actions. Sometimes it's as simple, and as difficult, as refusing to laugh at the wrong joke, refusing to nod when something in your gut says no, refusing to use ignorance as a shield when clarity feels too sharp. That's the daily quiet war that Bonhoeffer waged, not just against cruelty, but against the fog that cruelty uses to move unnoticed. And what's perhaps most sobering is this: Bonhoeffer knew he wouldn't win in his lifetime. He knew the machinery was too big, too entrenched, but he resisted anyway. Not because he believed he would stop it, but because he refused to be swallowed by it. That's the model he left behind, not the hero who changes everything, but the human who refuses to be changed by everything. We can't all be revolutionaries. We won't all be martyrs, but we can all be honest. We can all choose clarity over comfort. We can all refuse to let stupidity speak for us, through us, or around us. That's how resistance begins, not with volume, but with vision, not with anger, but with awareness, and not with a bang, but with a simple, quiet, powerful no. And what does that quiet no really cost us? That's the question most people avoid, because saying no to stupidity isn't just about resisting bad ideas, it's about challenging systems that reward those ideas. It's about standing in a room where everyone is clapping and having the courage to keep your hands still. It's about refusing to play along, even when the game is rigged in your favor. And that kind of resistance, it comes with consequences. Social, professional, emotional. Bonhoeffer understood that cost better than most. His resistance wasn't just philosophical, it was personal. He lost friends, he lost influence, eventually, he lost his life, but he never lost his clarity, and that clarity became his legacy, not because it made him safe, but because it made him free. He was imprisoned by the world, but liberated in his mind. And that's the paradox of true resistance. It can strip you of everything external, while giving you something no system can take: self-respect. In our world today, resistance looks different. It might not be a Nazi regime, but it might be a culture of apathy, a workplace where silence is encouraged, a community where conformity is rewarded, a digital landscape where dissent is mocked or misunderstood. And in that world, the temptation isn't always to agree, it's to disengage, to say, "It's not my problem," to scroll, to smile, to stay out of it. But that is where Bonhoeffer's theory cuts deepest, because when you disengage from stupidity, you're not neutral, you're complicit. We're not just responsible for what we do, we're responsible for what we permit. And permitting stupidity is the first domino. The rest falls slowly: injustice, cruelty, abuse of power, not because they were welcomed, but because no one told them to leave. That's how it happens, not in chaos, but in quiet, not with a crash, but with a shrug. So what does it look like to resist today? Maybe it's as simple as asking better questions, refusing to accept the first answer, digging deeper when things don't feel right. Maybe it's choosing discomfort over popularity. Maybe it's learning to sit with the weight of being misunderstood, and holding that weight with integrity, because clarity is rarely comfortable, and resistance is rarely celebrated. But if you listen carefully, the world is desperate for that resistance, not the loud, reactive kind, but the kind rooted in vision, in quiet courage, in the belief that truth doesn't need to be shouted to be heard, it just needs to be spoken by someone who means it. That's how movements start, that's how change begins, with one person refusing to play dumb. And maybe, just maybe, that person is you. Not because you're perfect, not because you have all the answers, but because you're finally brave enough to stop pretending you don't see what's happening, and brave enough to ask the hardest question of all: what part of me has been helping stupidity survive? Because that's where it all turns, not with blame, but with accountability. And from that place, not shame, not guilt, but clarity, you begin the quiet work of making the world a little sharper, a little bolder, a little more awake. That's how you honor Bonhoeffer, not by quoting him, but by choosing to be a little less convenient, a little less passive, and a lot more aware. The war is not always fought in the streets. Sometimes, it's fought in the silence between one thought and the next. And what you do with that silence, that's where your power begins. And now we arrive at the hardest truth of all, the one most people can't stomach, but the one Bonhoeffer lived and died by: that silence, in the face of stupidity, is not just weakness, it is surrender. And every time you swallow your voice, every time you soften your conviction to make others comfortable, every time you choose to sit instead of stand, you are voting, not with your words, but with your absence. And that absence is loud. Stupidity doesn't need your approval to thrive, it only needs your passivity. And Bonhoeffer saw this clearer than most. He saw how people who once claimed to love justice, faith, and dignity quietly became enablers of brutality, not through wickedness, but through cowardice. Because most evil doesn't rise with a roar, it creeps in on silence, on complicity, on the backs of people who were too tired, too afraid, too polite to say, "Enough." That's what this theory really demands of us. Not just intellectual sharpness, but moral courage. A willingness to risk being disliked, to risk being excluded, to risk being alone. Because standing against stupidity doesn't win you applause, it earns you resistance, laughter, maybe even punishment. But Bonhoeffer never stood because it was easy. He stood because it was necessary. And that's the line we all have to draw. So now the spotlight's on you, not to judge, not to perform, but to decide. What conversations have you been shrinking from? What systems have you been silently upholding? What moments did you let pass because it wasn't your place? Because here's the harshest part: if you wait until it's your place, it'll already be too late. The world doesn't need more agreeable people, it needs clear ones, brave ones who are tired of pretending ignorance is harmless. You see, the real battle isn't between good and evil, it's between clarity and comfort, between the people who see the truth and act on it, and the people who see it and choose to look away. But the world changes, slowly, painfully, because of those who keep looking, keep speaking, keep showing up when it's inconvenient. Not with rage, not with noise, but with resolve. That's your invitation, not to become a hero, not to be perfect, but to be conscious, to be aware of how easily stupidity seeps in when we aren't watching, to be aware of how quickly dignity dissolves when we stop defending it, and to understand, in the clearest possible terms, that you don't need a platform to make an impact. You just need a spine. Bonhoeffer had no stage, no army, no favor from the powers of his time, but he had a mind that refused to kneel, and a voice that would not be silenced, and that made him dangerous, that made him remembered. And you carry that same potential, not in your perfection, but in your refusal to pretend you don't see what's happening around you. So in a world that keeps asking you to sit down, stay quiet, and play along, don't stand, even if it's just in your mind. At first, even if your voice shakes, even if no one claps, because every step you take away from stupidity is a step toward a future worth living in. That's the legacy Bonhoeffer left us. Not just a theory, but a challenge. And now it's yours. What will you do with it?